David's film, How to Survive a Plague, is the raw and riveting untold story of a desperate and dedicated band of ordinary Americans who, watching their generation die of AIDS, succeeded in compelling the FDA to change its policies and bring life-saving, life-extending drugs more quickly to market. In addition to his Oscar nomination, How to Survive a Plague won top honors from the Directors Guild, GLAAD, the International Documentary Association. The New York Film Critics Circle gave it their Best First Film Award, and David is currently adapting it into a miniseries for ABC.
Great to be here with you on the, I think, 25th year of our working together on stories and storytelling.
It's our pleasure.
The reason we had trouble telling the story of How to Survive a Plague when you were at Crown was that everybody thought they knew the story. They thought that that it was a story that was in the past and that everyone understood it already, that there was nothing new to tell about it. And as often as we would try to say that there was, we hit that wall. And not just there, you know, I had trouble telling the story in magazines. I've been trying to cover AIDS on a regular basis since the early 80s. And as the years went on, I was able to get, you know, an article or two a year, if that many, published on the subject. I remember you and I we did the first story of a woman with HIV who chose to have a child in the late 80s, a very controversial story, and it turned out she was on the cutting edge of that whole idea that it was possible to have a child without transmitting vertically your HIV. Now that transmission has been eliminated entirely, thanks in part to the work that she was doing and that we were covering. But in truth, a lot of AIDS activism had fallen apart, and it fell apart after the successes of the mid-90s. And people were exhausted, and the death toll was just unimaginable, intolerable. People were grieving still. I had a hard time getting people to come and talk to me for the documentary about their own experiences. They just didn't want to go back and revisit it. And so it was traumatic for a lot of people to come and talk about it. But having done that, having opened up their histories, and having allowed me to introduce them to people, a generation of people who knew nothing about this history, really. I mean, that surprised me, that there were people, mostly people under 40, that didn't realize that there was the need for a vast social justice movement to bring HIV and AIDS and the plague years to an end. And that when they saw this story, they had a reaction to it that I wasn't prepared for at all, which was that they were thrilled by it, thrilled by the possibility of individual agency against something as massive as that, thrilled about the idea that triumph was possible, even against the most daunting of challenges. That it was possible to teach yourself something. And this was a story about activists who were not at all scientifically trained. They came, many of them college dropouts, some actors, a film archivist, a PR person who, because no one else was doing it, taught themselves the science of virology and immunology and epidemiology and attacked the epidemic as self-trained experts. And found themselves sitting in meetings, being invited to meetings to talk with Nobel Prize winners about their findings and to confer with them about strategy, about how to research, how to conduct research in the future. They did remake the way drugs are researched and approved and identified even in the laboratory, and the way that they're studied in humans and the way they're marketed. All of the way that we understand the pharmaceutical industry to help benefit humanity today has been impacted in a positive way by this small group of people who are self-trained citizen scientists, and that it is a thrilling story. I guess I hadn't, having lived through it, having watched it unfold the first time, I hadn't seen the thrilling aspect to it. And we showed it on college campuses across the country the year before we premiered the film theatrically. And almost every college campus we went to, an AIDS activist organization was spawned in the wake of showing the film there. And there's a small group called the Student Global AIDS Campaign, which had, when we started with the film, a dozen or so college campus chapters. And they work in the area of helping gain access to these drugs in the developing world. And by the time we premiered the film in the fall of 2012, there were over 60 chapters of Student Global AIDS Campaign, all responding to the energy that they saw in the film, and all trying to recapture that energy and rebrand it for today and the future. And it was a thrilling outcome. Also, the film is about ACT UP, principally, an organization which holds a really important place in history and in the public imagination, a less important place. And I think a lot of people thought of ACT UP as being troublemakers and people who stopped traffic and gained headlines and without knowing exactly what they did. And ACT UP is now revitalized in part because of the telling of the story through How to Survive a Plague. So it sparked things. It's been credited, I'll just say one other thing, the Dallas Buyers Club, the big film that came out last year that won so many Academy Awards. The director and the producer of that have told me that they would not have been able to do that film if it weren't for How to Survive a Plague. That proved that there was a kind of a hunger for this story about these desperate and brilliant times in the 80s.
So you and McConaughey are now close buds as a result.
All right.
Yeah. So
he is also one of my heroes. Yeah.
So actually, that's a good segue into the story that you were referencing earlier about how the film has gone on to continue to educate. You mentioned the way that the Ford Foundation folks use it, and of course also the business about the U.S. government and where they're using it in Eastern Europe. Can you?
Well, that was profoundly strange to me initially. Here's a story about people protesting the government and calling the government genocidal and calling the president and several presidents murderers. And then suddenly the government, the same government, a generation later, adopts the film officially as part of the furtherance of the campaign that was announced by Secretary Clinton when she was the Secretary of State, that linked for the first time lesbian and gay, bisexual and transgender rights to the human rights portfolio of the State Department in their international work. But nobody really knew how to do that in the far-flung embassies, and especially in places where there's now a mounting unfortunate campaign against gay people and the advances that the LGBT community has made in Eastern Europe, for example, in Western, Central, and Eastern Africa, in parts of Asia. And so they adopted the film as the film in what they call their toolkit. And they've been showing it in all these places and bringing either me or people attached to the film or people who are in the film to come and speak. And it is a strange experience, I have to say, to travel with the State Department with this protest film. But it finds its audience. We went to Kiev in the Ukraine in late November last year, just less than a week before people moved into Maidan Square there and began the revolution that toppled the government. I like to take some credit for that.
Go right
I'm
ahead.
not sure the State Department would give it to me, but as long as we all understand, yeah. But we showed it to people, and that's part of the world where gay people are not accepted. Where we showed the film publicly, where people stopped in the middle of the film to remark on there's a kiss-in in the film where actually several couples are kissing to make a point in part of their protest, which I won't try to explain. But the kiss-in itself was so disturbing for people in Kiev to see that it was it was as though it could have functioned as a barrier between them and the potential value of seeing the film. But it didn't. In the end, they were able to see the kind of fundamental power of it. And we also showed the film, and are still showing it in underground screenings in Moscow for the pro-democracy movement there. And they have done their own translation of it, and they use it as a kind of a strategy development tool for how to be clever and creative in protest in a place where protest is not permitted.
So just to reel back in time for a second, one of the things that we're engaged deeply in here right now at Consumer Reports is trying to bake the consumer reaction to our content early on so that our content is relevant to them. You told this fascinating story, you alluded to it just now, about in the last months of the edit, taking the film out on the road to college students and reacting to what people weren't understanding or what they were. So tell this group about that, because it's so fascinating in the sense that, you know, it must be it's a very intimate process in making a documentary, and now you have to kind of let other people in to do stuff to it. And did it make it stronger in the end, do you think?
I'll tell the story. Yeah. You know, I knew that I wanted to tell the story of AIDS and AIDS activism to people who didn't know it. So, and I knew it, and all my friends knew it, and all the people I had helping me on the film knew it. I brought in one of my editors, was in his 20s, and he had no idea. So it was really interesting to watch him discover through this footage this history and to know what resonated with him. What I really wanted to do was to take this social justice movement and canonize it, really, alongside the major American or even global, you know, civil rights movements. I wanted to show that it was as transformative as feminism had been, that it was as significant and utterly revolutionary as the civil rights movement had been. I wanted Americans in future generations to count AIDS activism as one of those major strokes in American history and in world history. And to do that, I had to find a way to speak to future generations. So, as Diane said, we started doing weekly feedback screenings on college campuses in the last 2 months as we were editing the film, to find out what people knew, what they didn't know, to find out how they were responding to things, to make sure we didn't leave people with questions, to make sure we connected with the audience. And it did affect the film really significantly, I think, and encouraged me to explain things that I thought people understood, and to let people have their own experiences with facts that I thought everybody understood in the same way. One of those, as I was explaining earlier, was with Jesse Helms. You know, Jesse Helms was at the time in such a force in the Senate that any legislation having to do with AIDS had to go through his approval process, personal approval process. He attached what he called the Helms Amendment to each one of those pieces of law. And the Helms Amendment was basically an anchor around its neck. It kept people from being able to discuss HIV prevention techniques. It prohibited on a federal level anything that might be perceived, meaning by him, to be endorsing the gay and lesbian community in any way as being at all deserving of federal protection. It made, for almost 15 years, it made all that legislation useless. And so he's like the villain in the film. And I wanted to like underscore that in a way. And I found out that I didn't have to, that people, younger people who watch those clips from C-SPAN, they just look at him and they can't believe somebody would be such an idiot. And they laugh at him, and they reduce him that way. And so I didn't have to tell them that. And that was really interesting to find out, that what I discovered was that the society, the culture had moved so dramatically in the years since then that it took somebody who was right at the very epicenter of power and pushed him so far off to the margin that you don't even have to spend much time dealing with him historically.
The other thing that CR has in common with documentary making is that we as an organization fundraise. And a number of the content groups are at the receiving end of fundraising grant money. And we were talking about how does the process of asking for money, raising money, ingesting money affect the content that you create. How did that feel for you? It was a different experience than other people have, but share with us what that was like.
It was new for me. I mean, I had done some fundraising for nonprofits, a little concern in my community I helped raise money for, but never for storytelling. And it seemed dangerous. It seemed risky because I'm an investigative reporter and have been for a long time, and it's hard to ask for money for that kind of work. People want to give money if they know what the answer is, right? So luckily, when I was raising money for How to Survive a Plague, I already knew what the answer was. I knew what the story was. I knew what the history was. So I could explain to people that this is the story I want to tell. And I did know from talking to other documentary filmmakers and from watching other documentary films that a lot of those projects are basically sponsored content, and that makes them not journalism and not history, although they might be good stories and might be good movies, and I wanted to do both, and so what I ultimately wound up doing was finding individuals who understood the history and understood the need to carry our stories of AIDS and AIDS activism from the plague years, from those 15 years of unmitigated death, to gather them together while we still can, to talk to people who still experience them, who are still around, and just save them and present them to future generations. So for me, it was a hand-to-hand ask mostly, from person to person, and pulled together a very solid group of people, individuals, mostly of means, who were willing to invest to make sure that the history got conveyed.
I'm just going to ask two more questions, I promise, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. You said, and I thought this was a very poignant and important point, that you've never been an activist yourself. You've never been an editorial writer. You are not an argument maker. That early on you used the tools of journalism and honored its boundaries to tell the story of activists. Talk about why that was important to you. Do you still feel that those things are very distinct in your mind? Is it possible to go forward in the world as an investigative journalist in all platforms and maintain that separation?
Well, I certainly think it's possible. I'll tell you why it was important for me. I came of age in the 70s. The journalism brought down a president in the 70s, and that was power. That was a power that was greater and wiser than any power on the national stage at the time. The power of uncompromised reporting was thrilling to me, and that's what I wanted to do. I was really drafted into journalism. As you mentioned, I was studying philosophy, and then AIDS struck, and I wanted to find something that I could do in AIDS. And I tried activism, and I just wasn't particularly good at it. I didn't bring any new skills or new ideas. And then I thought, journalism. Go and try to find the answers. Try to find the truth. And although it was never, my journalism has never been activism journalism, it has always sought the truth. And I think that should be the goal of all journalists, but certainly it better be the goal of investigative reporting. And that was challenged for me when ACT UP happened. I'm in all that footage really that I used. The film is made of this old footage that was shot by activists for the most part. 700 hours of archival footage from the 80s and 90s, and it captured me in the background, and I was surprised to see myself, and surprised to see how tentative I was at the margins of what they were doing. I was there with a notebook, always covering what they were doing. But I discovered that I never sat down. That while they were in their meetings, I always stood against the wall. For me, it was a kind of a symbolic barrier between me and what they were doing that kept me independent of them. The rules in the organization were anybody who attended 2 or more meetings was a member. So that would have made me a member. And the only thing that differentiated a member from a non-member was your ability to vote. And I never voted. You know, I would never have participated in that way because I wanted to be independent of them. I wanted to be able to write about them. And ultimately, while ACT UP was still in full flower, I moved to the science section of the New York Times, which I would not have been able to do had I been a partisan. Although it didn't mean I didn't have a dog in the fight. You know, it was my community that was being decimated by the disease. I wanted an answer, and I felt like I was helping to find it through journalism. I could contribute more than I could have if I had been arrested on street corners with so many other people in the organization.
So we live in a cross-platform world, as we see, because there's cameras, and the content groups are creating content now across many platforms. The business of your own transition from the printed word to film, and now having to go back to print, you have the book, and what lessons can you impart here? Has it enhanced your ability to tell stories in all platforms, having focused on one at a time? Or is it kind of mind-bending to keep them all straight now?
It was totally mind-bending. You know, the thing that investigative journalist doesn't have any experience with is visuals, and the idea that a visual can tell a story is something that magazine editors, of course, know, and certainly other people know. But I think investigative reporters are uniquely disabled that way, and so that was a lot for me to learn. And there's some wise man said that the way to tell a story in film is to start late and leave early, and on any scene. And I discovered that as a storytelling tool that's really valuable. That you don't need to explain as much as you think you need to explain, but you can bring people there and have them make their own discoveries, just by limiting the amount of information that you dictate to people. And I think that's what I learned in making the film. And the other thing which was surprising to me was how powerful a documentary film is. Even a hugely successful documentary film is seen by nobody. It's true. There are fewer than 25 documentary films that have made more at box office than $5 million, which means nobody has seen documentary films. And yet they have this ability to impact culture in a way that I wasn't anticipating, and to kind of change dialogue, and to start dialogue, and impact dialogue, and encourage dialogue. It was my multi-platform lesson, was that if you can use all of these tools, you can really get information out there, I don't know, it was fun. The other thing, and I'll just say this quickly, the other thing is that as an investigative reporter, you work all alone with a lot of paper in a dark room with nobody around to save you, and documentaries are very collaborative, and that was really fun, and it may have ruined me for the non-collaboration, I think, in the future.
So I want to thank David for his generosity in his time here today. Congratulate him again, and thank him for his inspiration in his life's work and in the time he spent with us today. And I want to thank everybody for coming and participating.